Well, welcome to the Lovettsville Historical Society. This is our final lecture of 2017. We run, for those of you who are new, a monthly lecture series, generally February through November. And next month, instead of a lecture, we will be holding our annual membership meeting, which will be on Sunday, December 3rd, and that will be held at the museum back behind here on Pennsylvania Avenue. And among things that we'll be talking about and looking at are Melanie Carty's renovation of the museum with a lot of redesign, cleaned up, painted, new lighting, new displays. And, well, you and Mike Zapp both did displays. But if you haven't been there, it's quite different than it was before. You may have seen some pictures in the last newsletter. And speaking of the newsletter, if we have a sign-in sheet in back, mainly that's if you want to leave an email, if you're not on our mailing list and would like to be to get the monthly newsletter, sign up there and sign legibly, please. If you sign legibly so we can read it, then you're likely to get the newsletter. If you sign every time, there's a certain number we can't decipher. In fact, I was joking with somebody yesterday who was talking about looking at Old German, which is easier to decipher. And I said, no, emails are harder to decipher than Old German. Yes, sir.
Speaking of the email, this last one that you sent out had listed a number of other events in the area. That's useful. I hope you can pick that up.
Okay. Good. Yeah, he's referring to we compile a list of nearby events of interest, many of which are actually in Maryland and Jefferson County, West Virginia, as well as Loudoun County. So good. I'm glad. I haven't got much feedback on that. I'm glad it's appreciated to do. Now, so that's the sign-in sheet. And then, as I said, next month will be the annual meeting. We're working on the lecture series for next year at this time, but we've got, in fact, I have more topics and speakers than we'll be able to fit into the year, so, which is always fun. But we will be doing more on the French-Indian War, some possibly on Daniel Morgan, Braddock's Road, which came up in a lecture, one of the previous lectures, references it, I guess it was in Gene Shields' lecture. So we will cover that. Probably one on Barbara Fritchie and the real story about Barbara Fritchie given by Chris Huff from Frederick, who tells a very good story on that. Want to do a couple local things, which I'm working on. I won't promise them until they're lined up, but we will have some on Lovettsville itself. We will have Doug Perks from Jefferson County, who was here before talking about West Virginia, who will talk about the Washington family, George Washington's siblings and so forth in Jefferson County, West Virginia. And we'll say what we know also about what the Washington family relationship was with Loudoun County. We, of course, will have to have something on the Civil War. We always do. Possibly Dan Toomey, who was here last year speaking about I think he spoke on the B&O Railroad on the reunions at Gettysburg, Civil War reunions. So we'll have a good lineup, and keep your eye out for that. Now, our speaker today, Peter Hanson Michael, is that it? Got the name right. I have it on my sheet here. Let me tell you a little bit about him first. We'll be speaking on John Hanson. As you know, that's why you're here. The first president of the original United States under the Articles of Confederation. Peter is the president of the John Hanson Memorial Association, which is the donor to the American people of the John Hanson Memorial, National Memorial, and the Jane Hanson National Memorial, his wife, both of which are in Frederick, Maryland. And Frederick is where John Hanson rose to national prominence during the Revolutionary War period. Peter Michael is also the author of, besides Remembering John Hanson, the book which he has here for sale and signing today, That book has won 2 national book prizes in biography. He has advised the federal government and the Maryland government on John Hanson, and he lectures widely on the subject. He is a descendant from John Hanson's immigrant grandfather, who was also named John Hanson, and from William Stone, who was the 3rd colonial governor of Maryland. Peter Michael has also authored a book called The Palace of Yawns, How the United Nations Failed Poor Nations in the Population Explosion. That book won a National Book Prize in Foreign Affairs. And another book is called Running on Empty, along an epic 12,000-mile road trip. America Has Its Say on Economic Equality. That's quite a title. That was awarded National Book Prizes in Political and Economic Affairs and in travel essays. He is also the publisher of the Underground Railroad Free Press, which is the top circulation Underground Railroad news publication in the country. He was a graduate of the University of Maryland, University of California at Berkeley, and Princeton. Lives with his wife, Vicki, who's a painter at Cooling Springs Farm, which is an Underground Railroad site along the Ballinger Pike, north of Point of Rocks. That site, that farm, was founded by the Michael family in, or as you may have pronounced it then, McKell, I guess, in 1768. So please welcome Peter Hanson Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Stannis. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, before we get to John Hanson, I was doing a little brush up today on the history of the German settlement here, as it's been known in my family, and came across some interesting things. I was telling a few of you a minute ago that our farm is just across the river. It's about 3 miles north of Point of Rocks, and there are 3 or 4 cases where Michael boys came across the river to find their German-speaking brides in the German settlement. The Michael family was German-speaking Swiss for a number of generations, and more recently, my great aunt married a German-speaking man from the German settlement. So there are connections, family connections, that we have here and that we remember fondly. But on the other side of the family, let's take a look at John Hanson, who was actually the first president of the United States. How so? We've had 2 governments in the history of our country. We're on the second one, which began famously in 1789 with the inauguration of George Washington. But before that, from 1781 to 1788, we had our original government with its constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and its presidents who served 1-year terms each, the first of whom was Frederick, Maryland's John Hanson. It pays, I find, to go over the organizations that existed in the early part of our country. We had 2 consultative bodies. They were called Continental Congresses. They weren't governments. The Second Continental Congress formed the first government, and then we had our 2 governments that I've mentioned under the Articles and then under the Constitution. In each of these slides, I think every one of them, there's a picture of one thing or another to add to the history. What we see here is the original presidential mansion in Philadelphia, where President Hanson and his wife Jane resided during his term. And that started one of the many traditions that got going in the Hanson administration, the tradition of the federal government providing a home for the president. And we'll see some other of these traditions. The first Continental Congress met in just about this time of the year in 1774. It met to discuss the problems that the colonies, the 3 colonies then, were having with Britain, and to form a strategy to deal with that. It lasted for several weeks. It had 2 presidents. Peyton Randolph of Virginia was the first. He had to return home, and for the last 4 days of the first Continental Congress, Henry Middleton of the Carolinas was the president 4 days count, so he's in the list here. What the First Continental Congress decided to do was to halt trade with Britain as of the 1st of December that year and petition Britain for representation in the National Parliament, since we had none there. And it also called for a Second Continental Congress, which began the following May. Now, that Congress met a month after the battles of Concord and Lexington, so it was busy. It lasted for until 1781. Here are its presidents. Peyton Randolph, again, was the first president of the Second Continental Congress, reprising his role. A couple of slides ago, you saw that there were 6 or 7 presidents of the Second Continental Congress. And where that ambiguity comes in is with Samuel Johnson in the center middle down there. On July the 9th, 1781, he was elected president when Samuel Huntington retired and went back to Connecticut, saying he didn't want to be presiding over a phantom body. Well, Johnston wasn't present the day he was elected. When he came to the Congress the next day, July the 10th, he said, "No thanks, I don't want to do this," and he refused to serve. And in his place, Thomas McKean, who was actually of 2 states, Delaware and Pennsylvania, was elected to serve out the rest of the Second Continental Congress. So you have 7 elected, well, only 6 served, and that's been a point of confusion ever since. And then here, finally, when the first government was formed, we had 9 presidents in its 7 years. If they had 1-year terms, how did we get 9 and 7 years? When, let's see, John Hancock was elected, he was too ill to serve, and he could not serve his term. And so Dr. David Ramsey, the youngest president we've ever had at 36, and Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts served in Hancock's place. So we had 3 presidents in 1 year. That's how we get 9 and 7 years. This is a drawing, artist unknown, of the signing of the Articles of Confederation, which ratified the Articles. And these dates here are important to keep in mind as we go through. These articles were ratified finally with John Hanson's signature, the last, on March the 1st, 1781. So was a new government created that day? No, it wasn't. Why not? Because the articles said that the government come into existence the first Monday of November that year. Exactly the same thing happened when the Constitution was ratified in 1788. That didn't create a government on the spot because the Constitution said the government shall be created upon election the following spring, which is what happened. So exactly parallel situations. But there's some confusion. The history of this era and this particular year gets a little weak, and you'll see that the government came into existence on March the 1st. It didn't. It called for the first Monday in November as the date when this would happen. The Second Continental Congress drew its last breaths from then until November the 4th, when it dissolved itself. And on the following day, the newly elected delegates took their seats. The first government was formed, and as its first act, the government elected John Hanson president unopposed. You hear that he was elected unanimously. He probably was, but nobody can find a definitive record of that. But it is definitive that he was unopposed. So when does a nation become a nation? It's not a nation until it has a government and a head of state. And that didn't happen until November the 1st, 1781, a date which is now just lost in history. There are very few Americans who know what that date means in terms of our national history. I didn't either. I thought that the United States came into being the 4th of July, 1776. Well, that's not true either. And I had a lawyer friend out in California explain to me that nationhood springs into being upon the creation of the first government and the election of a head of state. Then, and only then, do you have a nation. So here are the dates. 4th of July is famous enough. What happened on that day was some T's got crossed and some I's got dotted, and finally the Declaration of Independence as we know it got printed up and put out on posters in Philadelphia and elsewhere. That was a declaration of the intent to become independent. But then we still had, not states yet, but colonies. The 13 colonies, breakaway colonies, had to ratify the Declaration of Independence, and that took until August the 2nd, when the 13th and last colony ratified it, and the Declaration of Independence sprang into action, and those, on that date, colonies became states. They had been independent colonies, and as of that date, August the 2nd, they were then independent nation states, actually and legally speaking. They weren't bound together yet, but the Second Continental Congress had already put into motion a committee to draft a constitution, which became the Articles of Confederation, and that took some time. The next year, November of 1777, that committee got its work done. The Second Continental Congress made a few modifications, authored the Articles of Confederation, and sent the articles out to the 13 states at that time for ratification to become a nation. And quickly, by 1779, 12 of the 13 states at that point had ratified the articles, but Maryland held out. And Maryland did so because of what was called the Western Lands impasse, which I'll get to in a minute. But finally, when that got resolved, on March the 1st, the date we saw a minute ago, Hanson signed for Maryland, and the articles were ratified, and then on November the 5th, we have the election and the creation of government. This image that you see here was written by the Secretary of the government, Charles Thompson, a long-serving, forgotten American hero who served as the Secretary of both Continental Congresses, the first government, and then briefly for the second government. Retired, then founded the American Bible Society and lived a long and distinguished life. And what this says, if you can't read it, is that the Congress has met, the government has been formed, and John Hanson has been elected president. This went out in copies to all the states, the ambassadors, and others. So who's the first president? This really isn't a difficult question to answer. We've had two. We had George Washington, famously the first president of our current government, and before that, we had John Hanson as the first president of the original government. There's nothing complicated about that. In his time, Washington, Jefferson, other presidents up into the 21st century have acknowledged that Hanson was actually legally the first president of the United States. This is a great trivia question. If you're ever on one of those TV shows and they ask that question, you know who wasn't the first president. Hanson was born at Mulberry Grove, a beautiful old plantation down in Charles County on the Port Tobacco River. This is the home that his father built in the year 1700 and where George was born. I've had the privilege of spending the night in this home when friends of mine who were the previous owners were there. They sold it recently. He was born in 1715. He was the grandson, as has been mentioned, of the immigrant John Hanson, so the president was named for his grandfather. He was the son of Judge Samuel Hanson, who was the leading politician of Charles County during his life. I rediscovered his grave a couple of years ago. He was schooled, the president that is, at home, which was the custom at the time, and then briefly in England. He traveled there as a teen. He, for his entire career, beginning at the age of 15 when he began to manage his father's books, specialized in finance and accounting. He knew the double entry bookkeeping system that we use today and which had come into practice in England and in Europe. at that time. And his father was the largest tobacco broker in Charles County, and at the age of 15, he trained John how to run the books. He served in the Colonial Assembly off and on for a long time. He held other offices in Charles County. And then in 1769, he sold Mulberry Grove to his brother-in-law, Peter Conti, and he moved to Frederick, Maryland. Now, why would you do that? Frederick, Maryland was the wild frontier, literally, at that time, as was right here, or a little bit to the west of it, in 1769. The French and Indian War had just ended. Villages were no longer being plundered. He was 54 years old, which in those days was considered elderly. So why would you pick up and take your family and move out to the wilds of Frederick, Maryland? Opportunity. This is a picture of the Monocacy Valley from the top of Sugarloaf Mountain across the river. I took this picture a few years ago. It's a rich alluvial valley where things grow really well. Also, Frederick County at that time was everything west of Prince George's County, including what is now Washington, D.C., all the way out to the tip, the far tip of Maryland. So it was by far the largest county in Maryland in area. It was also the most populous county by 1769, and it was being filled up with mainly German and Swiss immigrants. My Michael ancestors were German-speaking Swiss, and also lots of Scots-Irish, people who had no particular affinity or liking for the British Crown and were not, had no reason to feel any loyalty toward the British Crown. And they had their own ideas. They were forward-looking. There were also commercial and investment opportunities in Frederick County. And what Hanson saw was that it was the head of that county was the most powerful elective position in Maryland, the Maryland colony at that time. The most powerful position was the governor, of course, but the governor was appointed by the proprietor, the owner of the state of colony of Maryland, and with the approval of the British Crown. And Hanson wasn't a loyalist or much of one anymore. He wasn't going to get that position. So where would he have a good political base from which he could act? In the largest county in the colony at that point, and a forward-looking county. And it worked. He came up to test the waters first, then moved up, and Frederick County elected him not only to every position he ever sought there, but actually two that he never ran for. This is his portrait that he sat for, I would guess. How old a man does this appear to be? 35 or 40 to you? By the Swedish portraitist, Swedish-American John Hanson. Jane also sat for her portrait. I'll show you that in a minute. When the Revolutionary War broke out, Hanson made no bones about who he was loyal to. He was loyal to this new entity called America and the United States. He viewed himself as a second-generation American, but foremost an American. He was still a British subject. Everybody who lived here was. But he regarded himself as an American, and he made no bones about it and began supporting people who were rebels, actually, in the Revolutionary War. The first thing that he did was to raise two militias of riflemen, real sharpshooters from the backwoods of Frederick County when the war broke out. And they were the first units to reach General Washington outside of New England states during the Revolutionary War. He was involved with arming Maryland. He owned an old block, in July of 1776, you'll get the date. He bought a foundry in downtown Frederick. It's still there. It's now called Sky Stage. was built by the other side of my family, the Michaels, a few years before that. And he used it, Hanson that is, to produce gun locks and the like, gun barrels and war materiel. Maryland asked him to, I don't know if it was take over, but certainly have a major role in Maryland's production of materiel and arms. He played a strong role in what became the Maryland General Assembly in early 1777, Maryland's first state government. Played a strong role in war financing, his specialty, and he recruited soldiers throughout the war. By the end of the Revolutionary War, Maryland had ended up recruiting more soldiers per capita than any other state. This is Hanson's statue in National Statuary Hall in the United States Capitol. Every state gets to have 2 statues in there of their sons or daughters, and one of Maryland's 2 is John Hanson. The statue was placed there in 1903. This is the Declaration of Independence. This is what the actual, this is a photograph of the actual, one of the copies. I think there are 13 of the Declaration of Independence. This is probably one down in the National Archives. When the colonies, still colonies in 1776, were looking at this draft of this thing called the Declaration of Independence, trying to decide whether they were going to sign it and become independent, there were 12 colonies in and Maryland out. And Maryland's reasoning in its, it didn't have a state government yet, but it had something called a Committee of Correspondence. And those people said, we support what the other colonies want to do, these 12 colonies. We wish them well, but we're comfortable as is, and we're not so sure we want to join this group. It wouldn't have worked. It would have left Maryland right smack in the middle of the north-south of the country, splitting the rest of the country in 2. And it was Hanson, among others, who took the lead in persuading the body, you need to join this, you need to sign this. And here, sitting up in Philadelphia, were the delegates of all of the other colonies at that point, having had drafted the Declaration of Independence on July the 2nd when they were ready to sign it. And their decision was, if Maryland's not here by the end of the day, the rest of us are going to sign it. And literally, a rider came in, riding in that day, saying Maryland's in, and permitting its delegates to sign the Declaration. And much of the credit for that, historically, is due to Hanson and his persuasive ways. Well then, he did it again. I mentioned that right away after the Articles of Confederation went out in late 1777 for the states at that point to sign, within 2 years, 12 of the 13 states had signed by 1779. But then for another 2 years, there it sat with Maryland again, the odd man out. And this time, the issue was what was called the Western Lands. There were 6 of the 13 colonies that during colonial days had been granted large Western land grants by the British Crown. And 3 of these land grants extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and one of them actually 200 miles beyond that. So those 3, watch the arrows, Connecticut's went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Notice that its western lands don't even connect to Connecticut. Pennsylvania's in between. How much sense does that make? And Virginia's extended all the way across, and so did Georgia's. I did some calculation, and if those 3 stripes across the country had to continue to belong to those 3 states, those 3 states today would have about 40% of the seats in the United States House of Representatives, and they really would have run the show. They would have had only 6 Senate seats, but it would have been, I'll say, more of a mess than even now. Also, we would have had Seattle, Connecticut, San Francisco, Virginia, you probably like that, and San Diego, Georgia. It just doesn't sound right. So Hanson was the one in Maryland who foresaw what would happen here. What would have happened was that the states without western lands, particularly small states like Maryland and the New England states, would have been just swamped. They would have been minor appendages to the United States and not had much of a say in things as soon as the population started filling up in the West. So he got Maryland to issue what was called the Declaration of Maryland, saying, we'll sign and help create a nation as soon as the 6 states with western lands cede those lands to the government to be for formation into new states from time to time. And there was an argument for 2 years, and finally it came down to the fact that do you want a nation or not, and one by one, those 6 states agreed, okay, we will give up the lands, this is a good idea. And finally, on March the 1st, that same date again, 1781, the deal was done, and Hanson famously was last to sign the Articles of Confederation. This is a picture I took of the restored courthouse in York County, Pennsylvania, in the town of York. Now, this is where the Articles of Confederation actually left the Congress and went out to the states to be signed. Why from York? Because the British had chased the government, the Second Continental Congress, out of Philadelphia, and the Congress had gone west, as far west as it needed to feel safe. That happened to be York, and this is where it was when that happened, when the Articles were finally issued. And each state had one of these small tables. Maryland state table, rather, is this one that you see right here in front. And that's where the action happened. So Hanson becomes president. Every president since then has inherited what? A functioning government. You know, we can argue about how well governments function from one pass off to another, but there was a government in existence for every other president to assume upon inauguration, but not for Hanson. Hanson and his cabinet had to build one from whole cloth, and they did. They couldn't afford to miss. If they'd fouled it up and it hadn't worked and there had been no government or it had been a failure, that would only have encouraged the British even more and discouraged the Americans, so it had to work. And it did. Hanson appointed the first cabinet. I'll just let you read this. Established all kinds of things that needed to be established, government structure. For example, got the Postal Service nationalized, Army, Navy, consular service. This wasn't a tripartite government like we have now with the 3 branches. It was one branch all rolled into one. So John Hanson acted basically as Chief Justice from time to time and would settle disputes between the states. Also, one thing Hanson did was he decreed the first official observance of 4th of July and Thanksgiving. Now, before Hanson was elected and before there was a government, there were 4th of July observances ever since 1776 and Thanksgiving observances for much longer before that. But they weren't official because they couldn't be, because there was no government to make them official. So that's one thing he took care of right away. There's all kinds of misinformation and missing information about John Hanson. I think more than any other president. I have a friend, a Canadian researcher, she's a PhD historian, very prominent, who has done a lot of work on the Underground Railroad, including Underground Railroad Josiah Henson. Henson was born in southern Maryland, down in Charles County, ended up living in Montgomery County for a while where he escaped, went north, learned to read and write, became a prominent lecturer and an advocate for abolitionism. His grandnephew was Matthew Henson, who was actually the first person at the North Pole, not Admiral Byrd. Henson was scouting ahead and basically said, "Over here, boys." And he never got credit for it, of course. And what Catherine told me was that she was almost certain, she had done everything but definitively pin down the fact that Josiah Hanson was actually the son of Dr. Josiah Hanson McPherson, who was a first cousin of President John Hanson. We all know how that happened back in those days. And when Hanson, with an E, wrote his autobiography, he had this to say: as the first Negro child ever born to him, I was his especial pet. He gave me his own Christian name. And there are other clues that make it appear that, in fact, Hanson was Hanson's father. Now, if this is true, Josiah Hanson and I have calculated, are second cousins 4 times removed, and I'm proud if that's true. I'm looking for a Hanson descendant so that that person and I can do a DNA comparison to find out. And I'm still looking. If anybody here knows of a Hanson descendant, by all means, please let me know and help me get in touch with the person. I always ask this every time I give this lecture. There's a lot more to that story, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's all in the book. Myths about John Hanson. There are some people who just don't want to believe that George Washington was not the first president. They don't want to believe that there was a government before the government that we have now, that anything could possibly have preceded the Constitution. Well, it did. There's just no doubt about the fact that the body that Hanson headed was a government. If you want proof, just read its Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. That is certainly a government charter. He was, you hear that he was the president of the Continental Congress. This stems from a confusion in terminology between Continental Congress, the Congress of the Confederation, which was the nickname of the first government, and then the actual name of the first government, which is a mouthful, the United States in Congress assembled. That's a good one, just not even to say. So he was not a president of either Continental Congress. And he was not the 3rd or 4th or 5th or whatever president, anything other than the first president of the first government. How did that get started? There are some people who say that, well, when the Articles were ratified, Samuel Huntington of Connecticut was the president of the Second Continental Congress, therefore he must have been the first president of the nation. He couldn't have been, because the Articles were ratified, but there was no government yet for him to be president of, and that didn't happen until November. He did not sign the Declaration of Independence. You hear this, he didn't sign it, just look at the signatures. He did sign the Articles of Confederation, and his was the key signature. He's not on the back of the $2 bill. What is on the back of the $2 bill is a nice engraving of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and with all the people there who signed it. He's not in the picture. And then finally, this is a doozy. This was a lot of fun dissecting. There was a genealogist in 1988 who did a little bit of faulty work and said John Hanson was the grandson of an indentured servant from Barbados who came in. Well, supposedly this indentured servant, who was impoverished, ended up producing sons who were judges and legislators, and a grandson who was a president. It didn't work that way. John Hanson's immigrant grandfather was actually, as you might guess, a wealthy Englishman who shows up in Charles County civic records as early as 1656, but the immigrant, who actually existed, the indentured servant, doesn't show up till 1661. I found him. He lived not far. He lived down in Hanson territory. There's no doubt about it. And he went to the next church over, where a lot of my relatives are buried. He was married to an Anne. In our genealogy, Hanson genealogy, which has about 4,700 names, there's no couple of John and Anne. So no, not an indentured servant. This medal here, actually I have this medal, and I wish I'd brought it today so you could have seen it. It's about this big. It was issued by the National Capital Historical Society in 1981 on the 200th anniversary of John Hanson's inauguration as president. It's a beautiful medal. I put an alert on eBay, and it sat there for years and years, and I'd given up, and one day I got an email saying, here's one available. It wasn't that expensive either. So I got it, this is it. And I thought, it worked once, I'll try it again and see if I can get one for my son. About another 5 years went by, and another one came up, and I got one for him. Well, why change governments? You know, here finally, you know, they got the Western lands conundrum ironed out. They created a government, they elected presidents, they established the structure, they put a cabinet in place, it's rolling along. Sounds pretty good. What was wrong with that? When the framers of the Articles of Confederation wrote it out, they were in the process of throwing off an oppressive government. You know, what they did not want to do was create another strong government, particularly with power concentrated in the hands of a few people, especially not one person like a king. So they went too far in the direction of writing a weak constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and that was the main problem. The Articles provided no taxing authority, so what the central government had to do was go out to the 13 states, hat in hand, for, quote, requisitions. Your share is so much. They got about 10% what they ever requisitioned, and they just didn't have enough money to operate very successfully. Well, why not amend the Articles to correct that? One feature of the Articles, the real death knell, was that to amend the Articles required unanimous consent of the 13 states. And that never happened. In Hanson's first month in office, there was a bill put forward to permit a 5% import duty to fund the central government. And the Congress approved it. It went out to the 13 states. 12 of them approved it right away, and the ever-doubting Rhode Island back in those days said no thanks, and that was the end of it. The Articles were never amended. And then you see here the lack of many of the features that got incorporated into the second government, the separation of powers, checks and balances, and so forth. So, to the credit of the first government, it deliberately put itself out of business. It convened the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and said, let's clean this up with a new document. That's what happened. The first government went out of existence in 1788, was replaced by the stronger second government that we have now, with a much, much stronger constitution. Our Constitution has really become a model the world over. It's lasted more than 200 years now. The world basically loves it. Dictators don't, but everybody else does. Well, Hanson's term ended the first Monday of November, 1782. He served his one-year term. He was elderly. He was 67, 68 years old at that time. He might have had a heart attack already. He was very ill for a period of about 10 days during his presidency. He said he was tired. He said he longed to get back home to Frederick. Well, he did. And as an elder statesman, he and Jane would get in their phaeton, which is a certain type of carriage. I had to look that up, the sleek-looking thing. And they would go around visiting here and there their friends in Annapolis, politicians, and family. And they were visiting their cousin, their nephew, Thomas Hawkins Hanson, who owned the Oxon Hill Manor down in Prince George's County in November of 1783, where John Hanson took ill one last time, and he died there. And as was the custom, rather than transport his body back up to Frederick, he was put into the Addison family crypt. Thomas Hawkins Hanson had married the widow Addison and had become the owner of the property in the crypt there where John Hanson lay in rest for a very long time. The manor house burned in 1895 after it had gone through several ownerships. The property was pretty much abandoned. It became overgrown with vines. In 1971, the burial crypt was, quote, rediscovered. I put that in quotes because a few people still knew where it was, but some who didn't, including the head of something called the John Hanson Society at that time, said, let's rediscover it. So they rediscovered it. There it was. It was intact. They cleaned it up. In 1984, the developer, not the current owner, Peterson Companies, bought the property, and by 1987, some archaeologists doing an archaeological study to put in that big interchange down there across where the Wilson Bridge comes across, surveyed the property and said that the crypt had been, their word, robbed, empty and robbed. All the coffins gone. By 1993, the site had been, according to the current developer, accidentally bulldozed. Okay, we'll see why it was accidentally bulldozed in the next slide. And then, it really was lost to time. In 2011, with the assistance of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, which I worked for as an 18-year-old, they and I rediscovered the site where the crypt had been. All right? And what's there now is this. A casino, a gambling hall, sits atop the gravesite of your first president. And this is a national shame. It is an absolute national shame. So, what happened to the coffins that were robbed from the crypt? We don't know. I thought I had it figured out. Was a little graveyard 400 feet away from the crypt site, the Addison graveyard, where there were some people buried without gravestones. That whole graveyard last week was reinterred at a nearby old graveyard so that the casino could be expanded. And they couldn't identify the 30 remains in there, all of them by name, but by process of elimination, there were some women in the old graveyard, there were some children. There was no body who fit the description of a 68-year-old man. So we still don't know where John is. I had high hopes. That's where he was. Well, this is the John Hanson National Memorial, which was mentioned. This is in Frederick. This was dedicated 5 years ago. It was a lot of fun and work getting this up and off the ground. It's in the courtyard of the Frederick County Courthouse. If you go up there, park next door in the Weinberg Center's parking lot, and go right across the street, and there you are. Other than John Hanson's statue in National Statuary Hall, this is the only place that Americans have ever had to be able to honor, is the word I want, honor their first president. And a local sculptor won a national competition. His name is Toby Mendez. Toby did this beautiful job on this. He's the one who did the Frederick Douglass statue down in Annapolis. He does a lot of sports statues, easy to work with. This was funded equally by private donations, which the John Hanson Memorial Association raised with an equal amount of state funding. Okay, and John's wife is quite a story in herself, Jane Hanson. She was actually our first lady. However, the title, that term, First Lady, didn't even come into existence until the 1850s, when the niece of President James Buchanan, our only bachelor president, went into the White House to serve as the nation's hostess since Buchanan wasn't married. And up until that time, the newspapers and the public had referred to as the president's wife. So they didn't know what to call the young niece. And one newspaper said, let's call her the First Lady, capital F, capital L, and it stuck. All right, and she kept being referred to as the First Lady. Her name was Harriet Lane, and when she was followed by Mary Todd Lincoln, everybody kept referring to her as the First Lady and on up into the present. And you see here that Florence Harding in the 1920s was the First Lady who was granted an office and a budget and a staff, and then finally the title itself became official in the 1930s. This is another portrait by John Huselius, the Swedish-American portraitist of First Lady John Hanson when she was, I'm guessing here, about 30. She had her own amazing story after death. She was a widow for 29 years at the end of her life. She was in the care of her wonderful son-in-law, Dr. Philip Thomas, who lived next door to her in Frederick. Thomas is a story in his own. If there were some sort of prize given to the best presidential son-in-law in our history, I think Thomas might get it. Jane died in 1812 at the age of 84. She buried 12 of her 13 children, if you can imagine that. I can't imagine that. 12 times. And she was buried in the Hanson family crypt in the old Episcopal graveyard there in Frederick. In 1913, the church wanted to sell that graveyard for development. There are condos there now. And 356 bodies in the graveyard were reinterred a half a mile away in the very large, beautiful Mount Olivet Cemetery in Frederick. Now, if you had a legible gravestone, you and it went over to Mount Olivet together and you were buried in the normal way beneath your gravestone. But if you had an illegible gravestone or none, or if like Jane, you were in an unmarked casket in a crypt, you were buried in a mass grave. There were 286 of them in a single mass grave, unmarked. This green mound that you see here is the grave. They did a nice job. They dug down through clay. They lined it with slate on the sides and the bottom. They put the people in there, including the illegible gravestones, more slate on top. Nice job. And then it was forgotten. Well, in 2011, the superintendent of Mount Olivet Cemetery and I and one other guy, we started looking through the exceptionally complete records of Mount Olivet, and it didn't take long. Within an hour or so, we had spotted the location of this mass grave where she is known to have been buried. And we walked right to the spot, so her gravesite was rediscovered. First John's and then Jane's. When you think about it, I don't think there's any more of an unfortunate end to a presidential couple except perhaps the Lincoln's assassination and her asylum. This is just a tragedy. However, once we discovered the spot, we did this, and we created a memorial to her. And this is the only place that Americans have ever had to honor their first lady. The sculptor, again, was Toby Mendez. Toby said, you know, his bid is $1,000 less than whatever the next lowest bid was. And he got it. It was his idea to do this dual memorial here with a bust of John and the bust of Jane. And he said, they've been separated tragically for over 200 years. Let's bring them back together again. She's there, he's not. But the idea, I just thought, was brilliant. And you can visit this too. I think the cemetery is open 24/7. So why has Hanson faded in his nation's memory? This is a painting here that's in the Maryland Historical Society of John and Jane's eldest son, Alexander Conti Hanson Jr., who became the top jurist in Maryland in his career. He was also the president of St. John's College in Annapolis for a stretch. He wrote the laws of Maryland in a very distinguished career of his own. When I was writing John Hanson, I said, I'm missing something. I said, I'm not a trained historian, but I have some friends who are. So I emailed to 20 of them, including a friend of mine who was a nominee for Pulitzer Prize in History, saying, I'm looking for a history of the 1780s, and I don't see anything out there. And I've scoured Amazon. There must be something. I'm missing it. Put me on the right track. And half or more of them wrote back, and most of them said, I'm a little embarrassed. I think I should know a good history of the 1780s, but I don't know any. And when 8 or 10 of them said this, I concluded there is no good history on the 1780s, and I'm convinced there's not. There's this gap in our history. The 1780s, that was the make or break decade for the United States. At the beginning of the decade, we were losing a war to the mightiest military on earth. Our army was starving. We couldn't get our act together to form a government. And at the end of the decade, we had successfully launched 2 governments. We were recognized the world over. We were getting lots of attention because of this radical notion of a Republican democracy, small r, small d. And what a decade and what a success of the decade. So why is nothing written about it? That is a mystery. And if there are any historians here who really want a great topic, there you are.
Isn't John Fisk the critical decade about that?
John Quincy Adams.
No, not Fisk. Fisk.
I don't know.
Called the critical decade?
John Quincy Adams called it the critical decade, which indeed it was. Also, here's the story of his grave. His family line has died out. I have been able to identify a number of direct descendants of John Hanson, but no one with the last name of Hanson, surname of Hanson. Until my biography, the most recent were 3 of them in the 1930s. I don't know how you research a biography without the internet. Boy, it must have taken a lot of work and shoe leather. And these 3 authors, and one of whom was a judge, they did the best they could, but the biographies are about a little thin, and they don't have bibliographies. There's that, the internet myths. And then in 1836, a historian borrowed from the family Hanson's personal papers. His official papers are at the National Archives. Borrowed the personal papers and some of the personal papers of George Washington to write a history on the collaboration between the 2 men, and lost John Hanson's papers. So there's that. And that'll do it, I guess, when a person's name dies out. But there are some remembrances of John and Jane. I'll just let you read this list here. On the left, we have John and Jane Hanson's grandson, Alexander Conti Hanson Jr., who was a United States Senator from Maryland. Under the Constitution, to serve as a United States Senator, you have to be at least 30 years old. Well, he was 29 when Maryland elected him, so he had to cool his heels for a few months until he turned 30 and could be sworn in. He died at the age of 33 of one of those diseases that people don't even get anymore, and that was a sad story. He played a very strong role in the War of 1812, opposing it. This is the book. I spent 4 years writing this. I don't have the words to tell you how much fun and enjoyment I had putting this together. It's like Christmas every day when you, unwrapping something. Oh, look at this. Discovering and discovering more and more. I went long on this book. I hope that this is not the last biography of John Hanson, but if it is, I wanted to include everything I could find. So the back material is pretty thick. I didn't want to clog up the narrative with too much detail, but it's all there in one place or another. So off it went, you know, and it got published, and I got good reviews on it. One day I was sitting at my desk opening the mail, and I was glad I was sitting down. It was a book prize, you know. This book had won a national prize in biography. I said, wow, Vicki, my wife, come look at this. And that was a great day. And then a month or two later, another prize came in. And I can't tell you how humbling that is. It's just absolutely amazing, particularly, you know, I'm not a trained historian, but people seem to like the book. What you can do, what I would ask you to do is keep this story in mind and tell your children, your grandchildren, your greats, if you're that far along, your neighbors, your friends, your colleagues, that there was a first government, that it served well. Of their 9 presidents, there wasn't a dud in the lot, you know, and since then we've had some duds. There were 9 good ones in a row, and they did what they were asked to do. They didn't get paid half the time. They deserve to be remembered. They successfully launched a second government that operates under a constitution that's the model the world over. It's a great story. It doesn't deserve to die, and I would just ask you to remember it and tell it. So thank you very much for coming today. I've been delighted to be here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, those of you who have been here before know that it's our custom at this point to pass the hat or pass the basket. We do not charge admission for these lectures. We would like to keep it that way. But to help us keep it that way, we ask that you be generous in your donations today. And we'll now take questions. Go ahead, I think you can call on people. You have one here?
Yeah, so as a designation, we recognize George Washington as the first president of the United States.
He was the 10th.
Of the United States. So was John Hanson head of state of the Continental Congress, or the Confederation, or the original government? What would be the title?
He was not, the Continental Congresses did not have heads of state because of ordination at that time, so he or nobody else could have held that title. He was the president of the first government. His official name was the United States and Congress Assembled. Okay. That's a mouthful. It's commonly called the Confederation Congress, but that's how it's with the Continental Congress, so they get confused. He was the first president of the first government.
If I were to tell my children something of the was the president of the United States of the Congress or continent?
Well, they would best if you tell them, I'll give you $100 if you tell me the first president of the United States. They'll get it wrong and then you tell them who it is. Oh, but if they know, you're out $100. Did you have another question?
Yeah, when you say the militia assembled from the western part of Maryland, the immediate concentration of militia was from which region? Frederick County or
Frederick and Washington.
Washington? Didn't go far out into the Commonwealth Maritime. It didn't exist.
They might have. What they recruited were riflemen, sharpshooters from the western woods of the county. And that county extended all the way across the state at that time.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
I mean, this is something we've been talked about here before. This is actually the formation of the first Continental Army. When Congress, the U.S. Army dates its birthday on June 14th, 1775, when Congress they trusted them in a way that they did not trust the seaboard cities, which were much more Tory dominated. So, and there've been a lot of arguments as to who was first to get up to Cambridge, right? Whether it was Maryland or whether it was the Beeline regiment from Shepherdstown. But they raced up to, literally almost raced each other up to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that's what became the Continental Army. So it's a very interesting story. And John Hanson obviously played a very important role in it.
Was John Hanson ancestry English or was it Swiss German?
My side is Swiss German.
Okay.
Okay, and the Hanson side, I've traced them back to the 1100s to a place in England called Rastrick. All right, they were English. Hanson can be a Scandinavian name, but in this case it's an English name. However, there's a story, unproven but probably true, that in a couple of generations before the immigrant John Hanson came to the United States, an English, one more John Hanson, visited Sweden, got married there to a Swedish woman, and the family, that branch of the family spent 2 generations in Sweden before 4 Hanson boys came to New Sweden, which is now Philadelphia, in 1640. And I think that story is true. I've seen it. There was a genealogist who tried to disprove it. He really messed that up. It's not disproven, but it's likely true, but I haven't been able to pin it down. Yes, sir.
I was surprised that some of the continental members that were going to be the presidents refused to be president. And we know that some people at that time felt strongly about their own plantations, and that was, how do you view those people that said, hey, no, I don't want to be president?
That's what I would say. Do you want to be president?
But Hanson did, for example, so there was...
He served. Or there was Samuel Johnson of North Carolina, who was president for a day, or was he? And you have a right to say no for one reason or another. Now, there was a fair amount of people coming and going because they did have their personal lives to tend to. And as often as not, they weren't being paid, either by the government when it came into existence or before that by their states, to sit in the Continental Congress or later the government. They weren't being paid, so they couldn't do that forever. So they would go back and forth. Peyton Randolph, he was the first president of the First Continental Congress. He had to leave to go home and handed it over to Samuel Huntington. Randolph again was the first president of the Second Continental Congress. He served as long as he could. He had to get back home. John Hancock took his place, and it was that kind of thing. It wasn't as if you get elected president, you have a $400,000 a year salary and all kinds of other perks that entice you to do it. Yes, sir.
I take it that Mr. Hanson was elected by the members of that Congress,
Yes.
who in turn were representing their states.
Yeah.
How was George Washington? So,
Well,
was there actually a vote among citizens of various states?
no, that didn't come about. There was not direct presidential election
the time period you're describing, particularly the Second Continental Congress, we are fighting a revolution against the British, a war of independence. What was the effect of that weakness on the war?
Which we,
In the Second Continental Congress before Peter Hanson comes in, and it still continues under the Articles of Confederation, but you have no taxation power, no funding power.
no, the Second Continental Congress was a consultative body. It wasn't a government. So what we had there after independence was 13 separate independent nation states. They'd been independent colonies and they became independent nation states. Much like the European Union today, we were united in purpose. We had a common enemy. We sympathized with one another. We had different ways of doing things. We still do as states. And the main problem was that we couldn't form a government. We spent 5 years doing that, and that only encouraged the British. All those people who want to call themselves Americans, they can't even get their act together to form a government. We'll take them. And that was the worry among the Americans as well. That was the main weakness, that we couldn't form a government.
How did we fight the Revolutionary War?
Barely. Barely is the answer. By the way, a real stroke of good luck for John Hanson was the month before he became president, we won at the Battle of Yorktown, and that was considered by both sides to be, fighting didn't end then, but everybody knew that that was over, that was the decisive battle, and that the Americans were going to end up victorious. And so Hanson got to begin his presidency with that off of his shoulders. Yes, ma'am.
Hold on to the Baltimore Afro-American Historical Genealogical Society. One of our members, last name is Hanson. His name is Jerry Hanson. He recently died, maybe a year ago, but I'll have to get his information and get that information. He's from Carroll County, Maryland, and he's a genealogist. And I think he spells his name either H-E-N-S-O-N, H-Y-N-S-O-N, which of course that doesn't. Oh, okay, yeah, well, yeah, Josiah Hanson is H-E-N-S-O-N. This Jerry Hanson, I think it's H-E-N, but I can get your information and then get his information from the family.
Thank you. And let me give you my card.
Yes, yes. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
I knew if I asked that long enough.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
You said the Americans barely won the revolution. How did the British lose the war with all of their amenities?
Well, in the end, it was because of the French. The French wanted to see Britain lose the war. French and British going at each other at that time. And Count Rochambeau, who was a Navy man, and Count de Grasse, and who was the young general? Marquis de Lafayette, 19-year-old French general. They came over and helped. If they hadn't helped, we would not have won the Battle of Yorktown, and the war would have dragged on, and it could have gone either way. But we were wearing British down. It was basically a guerrilla war. Sometimes our soldiers had uniforms, and sometimes they didn't. It was just a man carrying a rifle in the street.
So the French should be our friends rather than the British.
The French were our friends.
Should be our friends now.
Absolutely. Yes.
You know what the death of the children, this is very 12, was it all sorts of things?
How did the Hanson children die? If you look at their ages, some of them died at birth. There were two sets of twins, okay, and one set of twins died at birth. Another set, one died at birth, one died a little later. They were probably little, and two of the boys died in the war. One from disease, one from a gunshot. And the others probably died, well, their eldest daughter, Jane, also Jane's mother, Jane's daughter, died at 34. She was a mother of 4 children. Died at the age of 34, probably one of those diseases that we don't get now. few left could be helping old age. That was your Social Security. Questions? Yes?
How old were you when you first learned about all of this, and how did it develop through your life that ultimately you came to write that book?
I think I heard my mother talking about it when I was in the womb. My brother and I, we had this, I think it's fair to say, had it drummed into our heads by Mom and our Hanson grandmother. My grandmother was a Price, she married a Hanson, but she ended up knowing the Hanson history as well as he did. So I heard about it growing up. Thank you very much.
Anybody here can say they didn't learn a lot today? This is the second time I've heard Mr. Hanson talk, and I learned a lot. Yeah, very interesting. Thanks again.